Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about EBITDA, Part 1. Planning a 3-part series here, definitely 2 parts at least. So, here we are, EBITDA Part 1, cooking the books. A diversionary tactic, a half-century long psyop of specious subterfuge and ostensible subversion. Habits are hard to break. You use EBITDA because of what happened half a century ago. The mass adoption of EBITDA is often attributed to the multi-billion-dollar cable industry. The gist of the story is that a guy named John Malone, who was a media mogul who became the CEO of a cable company and media corporation in 1973, used EBITDA to communicate the company's ability to service its debt obligations to lenders and bondholders and to assuage the debt holders' insecurities around the high levels of leverage on the balance sheet. You see, prior to the late 1980s, the statement of cash flows, let alone cash flows from operations, was not a required reporting metric for public companies in the United States. Due to the large depreciation expenses of the industry, net income wasn't a suitable metric for gauging the ability of the cable companies to pay the interest on their debt, although they had the cash flows to do so. Thus, the use of EBITDA fell into heavy practice, because EBITDA can be derived from using the income statement. There is no need in that sense of using EBITDA it doesn't need a cash flow statement. So, thus, the use of EBITDA fell into heavy practice. It was an attempt to help bondholders better understand the company's ability to pay them back. The statement of cash flows, including the cash flow from operations figure, was not mandated by accounting standards until 1987. 1987 is when the Financial Accounting Standards Board issued Statement of Financial Accounting Standard number 95, which required public companies to provide a statement of cash flows. This means that there was a solid decade plus of EBITDA reporting without any official statement of cash flow. It was out of necessity that the invention of EBITDA arose, and this decade plus head start also allowed EBITDA to entrench itself into financial reporting. All of this means that the reasons that EBITDA came to exist are in large part no longer the reasons that it currently exists. Like I said, the statement of cash flows reconciled the issues which created the need for EBITDA. And yet, here we are, half a century later, still using EBITDA. But why? Follow the money. People love familiarity and simplicity and disdain complexity and comprehension. And management teams love a reporting metric that affords them flexibility to finagle a flattering figure. EBITDA is now a means to a different end. It now serves as a more flattering, favorable, and fungible figure. It's been misused and co-opted from those who initially had good intentions by more nefarious actors trying to obfuscate. This is all due to the beneficial and privileged picture EBITDA provides. Just imagine if analysts had to switch from EBITDA to CFO, cash flow from operations. The multiple re-rating would be significant, with cash flow from operations acting as the new fill-in for EBITDA. There are a lot of companies with positive EBITDA but negative cash flows. Analysts and investment bankers would have to change their estimates and, worse, downgrade their customers and clients when switching from EBITDA to CFO. There's this open secret kayfabe that occurs. People say that they use EBITDA as a proxy for cash flow, but most of them know that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. But that's why they use it, to maintain an air of plausible deniability one step removed. It allows things to trade higher than they actually would if we were referencing the metric cash flow rather than the other metric EBITDA, which is supposedly supposed to represent cash flow and is a proxy for. It's a big game of pretense and pretending. Yes, billions and billions and billions of dollars sloshing around on pretend figures which don't translate well to the alleged thing that they're supposed to translate and represent, and most people of any significance are aware of this. Underwriting and issuing shares comes with lucrative commissions. Do you think that the other investment bankers jockeying for position to the trough of free tendies are going to rock the boat by using a different and less flattering figure? Especially when the other investment banks are more than happy to play along. These institutions have close working relationships with the management teams. Why would they bite the hand that feeds them? Honesty? Integrity? Honor? LOL. That's a naive and delusional way to think. Simply put, it's an I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back dynamic and feedback loop that keeps the house of cards known as EBITDA propped up. And even if there aren't diabolical and Machiavellian dynamics at play, do you think the C-suites of these firms are going to let their analysts write freely and truthfully? That wouldn't be good for business or their bonus. And by the way, the people paying for the analysis want to be lied to as well. It's a convoluted and distorted mess. They'll stop buying the services if they don't get told what they want to hear. In all bubble situations, analysts keep pushing out dribble and ludicrous forecasts because their customers don't want to be told to sell out of their stocks as they're going up each and every day. Russell Napier pointed out this fact during the lead up to the Asian financial crisis. I'd recommend buying the book or the audio book and listening or reading it. And don't forget, the investment bank clients have customers and clients themselves, and they certainly don't want to prudently sell out of stocks while watching their peers get richer. Like I said, people want to be lied to and they'll punish you for telling them the truth. Then consider that analysts are pressured either explicitly or implicitly to highlight the metric that the company executives prefer, even if it doesn't provide the most complete or objective representation of the business. Maintaining access and good standing with these corporate clients is important for securing future investment banking deals and commissions. The vested interest that analysts' employers have is in securing lucrative business from the companies they cover. So, do you think they'll be using more or less rigorous metrics? And it's this dynamic which compromises the so-called independence and objectivity of the analyst community. Why do you use EBITDA? At this point, we've discussed the origins of EBITDA and why institutions and financial firms continue to use it, but that doesn't necessarily answer the question of why does retail use it, i.e. you, in all likelihood. Is it because they're financially illiterate and vulnerable to misleading metrics? And is that the consequence of them being overly impressionable due to being naive and ignorant, which has caused them to develop ill-conceived notions and misguided beliefs? For instance, no one is asking the following line of questions. Is it EBIT, earnings before interest and taxes, known as operating profit? If so, then why is EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, often referenced as operating profit? Wouldn't this make EBITDA adjusted operating profit since it further adds back D&A, depreciation and amortization? And doesn't that then make adjusted EBITDA, a very commonly referenced figure, adjusted operating profit? How many turns of adjustments are there? Shouldn't adjustments for SBC, stock-based compensation, be an adjustment in and of itself, as well as impairments, restructuring costs, and so on? Shouldn't that make it adjusted EBITDA? And as we've already discussed, EBITDA is adjusted operating profit derived from EBIT. So now we're up to 5 adjustments. Adjusted EBITDA. This is what it would look like if we didn't lump together all the independent individual adjustments into a large categorical placeholder phrase innocently referred to simply as adjusted. And if we're using Tilray as an example, we'd still have several more adjustments to make. Tilray says adjusted EBITDA is calculated as net income before income tax benefits, net interest expense, net non-operating income expense, net amortization, stock-based compensation, change in fair value of contingent consideration, purchase price accounting setup, impairments, inventory valuation allowance, other than temporary change in fair value of convertible notes receivables, facility startup and closure costs, litigation costs, restructuring costs, transaction cost, and gain or costs and loss on sale of capital assets, not non-operating facility. I don't know how many adjustments that is on top of the other adjustments, which EBITDA in and of itself is. Or how about everybody's beloved Curaleaf? They reported earnings today, and I'm reading this on Sunday, so this, I believe, was, I don't know, Thursday or Friday, something like that. So they reported earnings recently. Look at this foolishness. Acting as though it's even remotely appropriate to pretend like a metric that excludes add backs such as rent and PR and other facility costs is a worthwhile metric to report. But desperate times call for desperate measures, I suppose. Financial engineering, mental gymnastics, cognitive dissonance, and a willful blind eye towards corruption can take you to some interesting places. Places which appear contradictory and inconsistent, but that's due to the compartmentalization and isolated one-off treatment of reality. Each adjustment is a so-called one-off, and then it gets lumped together under a singular recognition, an umbrella term, and casual phrase such as adjusted. The way I see it, practically everyone is complicit, complacent, and compliant. Even I. When you confront someone as to their EBITDA usage, you'll find that most responses are characterized by obfuscation and deflection. They resort to appealing towards ostensible technical details to avoid directly addressing the core issue, which is why the preference for EBITDA over cash flow. And it's not just in finance. As I've said before, cope, fallacy, and bias know no bounds, and you take it everywhere you go. You find that most people are just one large rhetorical smokescreen. What might some of these technical details look like to explain their usage of EBITDA? People will give ostensible reasons, such as EBITDA helps gauge a company's operational efficiencies, or EBITDA helps facilitate comparisons between companies within an industry, or EBITDA helps determine if it's trading at a decent multiple. You'll note that these reasons apply just as well to many other metrics. Those above three reasons are tangentially associated but not mutually exclusive to EBITDA. Indeed, those are reasons to use EBITDA, but those aren't the reasons that they use EBITDA. The reasons they use EBITDA is due to a well-meaning attempt made half a century ago that's now become a full-blown psyop to the tune of a specious subterfuge and ostensible subversion. I assure you, these people didn't sit down and consider the set of valuation metrics to aid them in their investing to then consciously decide that EBITDA was the way to go about it. Let's not kid ourselves. They use EBITDA because they're a product of their environment, for better or for worse. People will bullshit you to the ends of the earth if it means that they can keep intact their sense of autonomy, intelligence, and intentions, what I call AII. People are largely unconscious post hoc rationalizers, and when they're not busy being that, they're busy trying to deceive you to save face in a brand management fashion with their autonomy, intelligence, and intentions as a primary concern. In all probability, people that use EBITDA do so because that's what other people do, so therefore they do it too. Simply put, most people, especially retail investors, use EBITDA because of conformity and consensus, in an appeal to authority kind of way. So, will you or these retail investors that I'm speaking about be more than happy to exchange their price to EBITDA metric for a price to cash flow or a price to free cash flow metric? Or how about EV to cash flow or EV to free cash flow? Highly unlikely. This is how you discover that there's other motivational reasons and contributing factors for their behavior. After all, if the reasons they cited are indeed the reasons for them to use EBITDA, then they're not losing out on anything by switching metrics, right? It's only once you keep constant your comparisons, control for the variables, and compare to counterfactuals that the game reveals itself. You come to realize that their answer is intellectually dishonest and disingenuous. Their preference is towards rhetorical smokescreens, not in addressing the relative merits of the metrics they're using. And if they do discuss those merits, they only do so in isolation and not relative to the set of potential metrics that they could be alternatively using. They're more concerned with pre-selection, third-party confirmation, appeal to authority, and peer validation. And all of those mental shortcuts have led them to use EBITDA. On a certain level of analysis, you could say that EBITDA is like communism. In theory, it sounds nice, but in practice, it doesn't turn out that well. Why? Because it almost always devolves and deteriorates into something else. Because once you entwine it with the human condition and put it into practice, it doesn't quite look the same anymore. People's propensity to make tweaks and adjustments is insatiable. In this case, it often transforms into adjusted EBITDA. Some versions of adjusted EBITDA merely remove stock-based compensation, while others, such as the Tilray example or the Curaleaf example mentioned earlier, adjust for much more. The category of adjusted becomes the void to shoehorn everything unflattering into. The phrase give an inch, take a mile comes to mind. Another term for EBITDA could be EBITDA bis, which stands for EBITDA before stock-based compensation, asset impairments, restructuring costs, acquisition costs, and litigation costs. But you can't say that though, because otherwise people will say, hold the brakes. You can't bring it to conscious attention. Like you can't bring to conscious attention the individual line items that you're adjusting for. That's why you can't say whatever made up word I just said. I'm not even going to try again, because they would say, what's all of that? But if you lumped it into an A, as in adjusted EBITDA, instead of EBITDA bes, they'd be like, well, what was all those sounds and syllables? What was that about? So you can't bring it to conscious attention. Out of sight, out of mind. It's much easier to lump all of that together and place it into the set called adjusted, or A for short. That's pretty insidious if you ask me. Of course, there's a specious argument provided for why each one of these things are inconsequential or should be extracted out. Take, for instance, stock-based compensation. They'll tell you that it doesn't reflect the operational performance of the business and thus it's a distraction from that, thus the exclusion. But that misses the point to some extent. A company being valued on EBITDA that grows 100% has much different results in regards to the share price if they have also doubled the share count in that same time frame. My point is, ultimately, shareholders care about shareholder returns, and operational metrics are supposed to theoretically reflect the kind of returns a shareholder should get. But stock-based compensation can create a disconnect. Operational improvements should correlate to share price appreciation and value, but it gets offset and canceled out by stock-based compensation. It's not like they don't know this. Their job, in large part, is to gaslight you to think that that's okay. It's similar in kind to nominal versus real wages. Growing your income by 100% isn't as impressive sounding once you realize that your purchasing power in that same time period has deteriorated by half. Now just imagine someone trying to gaslight you by congratulating you on your wages appreciating 100% while ignoring your purchasing power falling by half. Well, what management is doing is similar in kind. Just remember, at the end of the day, you should care about your share appreciation your shares appreciating in value and your purchasing power remaining stable or improving. The problem with this is that most people think in nominal terms. In this sense, they act with a numerator bias. People focus on the growth of EBITDA or their wages without accounting for the corresponding increase of shares or decline of purchasing power. But this is what people do. They disproportionately weigh things in a distorted and bastardized fashion. This is why governments prefer printing money over raising taxes. It's functionally the same, but it's much more tolerable to the average person. People think in absolute nominal terms more so than real relative terms. The numerator in these examples is more psychologically salient and compelling than the other abstract and less tangible concept of purchasing power and factoring in multiple variables such as EBITDA and share count. There is no ready solution to this on a broader scale other than people getting desperate enough. But you can tend to it on a personal level, which is why I'm bringing it to your attention. Adjusted EBITDA, let alone EBITDA, excludes such things as CapEx and debt servicing. And it's being used in an industry, the cannabis industry, which is what inspired this article, and it's being used in an industry which has historically spent vast amounts on CapEx and debt servicing. This is really worth thinking about. It sure is an interesting juxtaposition. The retail crowd might not know how irresponsible and disingenuous it is for these companies' management teams to use and report a figure which excludes CapEx and debt servicing. But you know who does know? The management teams. They know how irresponsible and disingenuous it is. If all else fails, the EBITDA user has on ready standby the exemption phrase of course it's not an end-all be-all and it should be used as part of a comprehensive model for gauging a business. This is the caveat clause and thought-terminating cliche that's so often used by these sorts of people. It's similar in kind to how people say we're all born of sin or no one is perfect. It's oftentimes an excuse for inaction and deflecting accountability. It's the same line of BS that people use when taking psychiatric drugs or medication for their health. It's supposed to be part of a comprehensive plan, but if we were being honest with each other and ourselves, it's rarely used that way. The risk you run with such a simple question. What do these two questions have in common? Question number 1. Why do you do chin-ups with a partial range of motion, hyperextend your neck instead of retracting your scapula, and quickly descend through the eccentric portion of the rep? And question number 2, why do you use EBITDA? These people are trying to shortchange success. You'll irritate them with such questions and give them negative feelings towards you. They don't know why they do what they do. Like I said earlier, most people are largely unconscious. But they'll be more than happy to give you some bullshit for an answer. They're both a litmus test of gauging self-awareness and honesty, these two questions I just asked. The kayfabe that people play on a day-to-day basis should never have its fourth wall broken by bringing attention to it, meaning that the unspoken fictions and illusions that we socially act on shouldn't have attention brought to it. No need to rock the boat. You play your role, adhere to certain social conventions, and never draw over attention to the artifice behind it. To break the fourth wall is to ask for trouble. It disrupts the smooth function of social interactions and relationships. It makes people self-conscious, and they hate feeling self-conscious. To highlight their performative art gives them bad feelings and makes them quite uncomfortable. They refuse to deviate from their script. Essentially, you can't go around trying to red pill people who chug bottles of blue pills all day, every day. Maintaining a level of discretion and respecting the unwritten rules of social exchange is crucial for preserving social cohesion and interpersonal comfort. Anytime you ask anyone why they're doing what they're doing, you run a high risk, and I do mean high, of knocking the slats out from underneath them, as it's often a weak and superficial veneer and exposing them to the abyss of ignorance. And ignorance they work extremely hard to maintain. This is why discretion and discernment are crucial for such innocent conversations. You're opening up Pandora's box. I found that in order to preserve a relationship, you can generally only go 2 layers deep, and generally the second question is pushing it. This is what it would look like. Why do you use EBITDA? That's question number 1. And then they'll give you some of the answers, like the 3 I provided earlier, and then that's when you say, but the reasons you cited for EBITDA equally apply to CFO, so why not CFO? Now, whatever answer they give, you just have to say okay, but you can't also act in a way that's dismissive or intolerant or have the micro expressions or the subtext or the intonation in your voice that would suggest that you think they're an idiot, which would be hard to pull off. But nonetheless, that's it. In all probability, they either say, I don't know, or awkwardly stumble through a partially coherent attempt at post hoc rationalizing why it is they use EBITDA. Pressing it any further bypasses the point of diminishing returns and immediately throws you into negative returns. They might feign politeness for the remainder of the conversation, but I assure you once they walk away, they'll be saying nasty things about you. Why? They have never thought that far, and now you're implicitly attacking, that's how they'll take it, attacking, a metric that they've incorporated into their ego, unbeknownst to them, of course. Everything is attached to a story and then their ego. They use EBITDA because, and this is what it would look like. Well, they use EBITDA because they're smart and decisive, and EBITDA is their chosen metric as a consequence of their smart decisiveness. To say that they got EBITDA wrong is to say that they're wrong, and only bad people are wrong. How dare you call them bad? And who do you think you are, Mr. Self-Righteous? In conclusion, status quo thinking, lazy legacy thinking, herd mentality, institutional phase lock, personal incredulity, and intellectual lethargy are all contributing factors as to why many people use EBITDA. Which is interesting because I've never once heard anyone cite any of those reasons as to why they use EBITDA. But people are so hell-bent on trying to provide virtuous reasons as to why they do what they do to save face that they can never assess their actual behavior or motives. They just keep on keeping on. And this only emboldens and entrenches us in our poor performance due to our poor thinking and limits what we could alternatively achieve. Adopting self-sabotaging mental models might conform your afflicted ego and assuage your insecurities, but I assure you it's at a cost. And since we all claim to think in risk-reward terms, we probably should reflect whether it's really worth acting that way. You find out that the story of EBITDA is similar to the 5-monkey experiment, aka the monkey ladder experiment, and how one monkey passes on behaviors to the next monkey even though the adopting monkey doesn't know why. Similar to those in the study who pulled one another off of a ladder for reasons they didn't know until they're all pulling monkeys off the ladder, and yet none of them ever experienced the reasons why they were doing it in the first place. We too are largely clueless as to why we use EBITDA. EBITDA is the metaphorical equivalent of pulling someone else off of a ladder without really understanding why we're even doing it. We just do it because others did it to us. So we just perpetuate the cycle, the tradition. If you haven't heard of this experiment, it was conducted by Harry Harlow. Oh, this just in. None of that actually happened, and it was falsely attributed to Harry Harlow due to his work with monkeys. And just like that, I too have fallen for saying and doing something because others did and said something, and it all turned out to be false. This is why we must question the concepts in a statement or story as much as the statement or story itself. P.S. The ending here was beautiful. I was actually looking up the monkey ladder story to brush up on some of the details to draw a comparative metaphor, and in that process, I actually discovered it's seemingly an apocryphal story. LOL. Talk about a beautiful self-own and irony. But nonetheless, it only further emphasizes the points I've made here today. Thank you for listening and watching. Until next time.